such a thing as historical truth? Unfortunately, because history is told by human beings with innumerable perspectives, the answer is most certainly a no. Today's show is an example of reconceptualizing the past after looking at sources from a different viewpoint. We deep dive on Alexander Hamilton with Jessie Serfilippi. This is Too Complicated for History. Well, thanks so much for being here with us today, Jessie.
Thanks for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Well, we're really excited to have you here. We've read your work. And before we get into that, I just want to ask you a little bit about your background. I know that your schooling is in writing. And so how did you get all mixed up with Alexander Hamilton and the Schuylers?
Sure. So, I have my BA in English and MFA in creative writing. So, not your traditional background for getting into this field, but somewhere along the way during, I think, my second year in graduate school, I decided to try an intern in the history field. So, I did 2 internships and I called Schuyler Mansion because I was really interested in working there. And I was like, can I have an internship here? And they said, no, but we have a job opening. So that was infinitely better than an internship.
No, but we'll pay you. That's wonderful.
Yeah. I was pretty thrilled. So, I honestly didn't know if I'd get hired because I had this English background, but here I am. It all worked out. I've been there since 2017. And I have to say, I think having the writing background has helped me a lot because I can, read, research, edit the same way. I just kind of switched it to a different field.
Yeah, that sounds great because I think that both Isaac and I have experienced this, having to read a historical monograph that is poorly written is, something that I had to deal with throughout graduate school. And so having a historian who can write well is very much appreciated by your readers. And of course, you have a much greater audience with your recent work. And of course, I'm talking about your article that's called An Odious and Immoral a Thing, Alexander Hamilton's Hidden History as an Enslaver. So first things first, can you tell us a little bit about what that article is about?
Sure. So the article is just a detailed but taken straight from the primary sources account of Hamilton's history with slavery in general, but also as an enslaver. And I highlighted the enslaver portion in the title because that gets the longest kind of part in the article. And I thought it was the most important part since the first part I write about his history with slavery isn't something that a lot of historians are new with. They have heard it before, but it was kind of the part about him as an enslaver that was new and I thought really needed to be pushed to the forefront, or it wasn't new. It just wasn't really talked about or looked for in the historical documents. So I wanted to push that to the forefront, but the article takes you through his history with slavery, trying to kind of debunk some of the more popular myths out there just by going through primary source after primary source in hopefully a way that isn't too boring, but just kind of laying out the facts.
And just for our listeners to be aware of, I'm sure that most people are vaguely aware, at least, of Hamilton as and his reputation in anti-slavery movement and the popular notions of him as an abolitionist. But in detail, either Lynn or you, do you want to go through a little bit of what that popular narrative of him is, or like what is the most recent narrative that has been embraced? Because it's pretty specific.
Well, I'm gonna hand that to Jessie, and I have to say that I know she's a big fan of Hamilton, the musical, and I saw it on Broadway too, so I'm right there with you. And I think that also has a part in the narrative. So I'm going to hand that off to her.
Definitely, yes, I am a fan of the musical. And since we end up talking about it a lot at work, one of the things I always say is it's a great piece of art, and that's what I largely see it as, and as a way to get people interested in history, which is great. That and other biographies on Hamilton really have led to this idea that he was an abolitionist and that he was totally against slavery. Some biographies do, like I say, kind of admit to the fact that he was selling people to relatives, to friends, that he was acting as a lawyer in certain cases, but they still say he was an abolitionist, mostly leaning on the fact that he was a member of the New York Manumission Society, which a lot of people were, and most of them enslaved people. So it's not saying too much. So the musical,
most of the members enslaved people, not most of the members were enslaved people. Just to be clear.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, most of the members were enslavers. Even the founder, John Jay. So it wasn't, he was not alone in that fact. It doesn't really speak to him being an abolitionist. And the musical really bolstered this idea of him being an abolitionist, and that wouldn't even necessarily be true in his, even if he was not an enslaver. As a member of the New York Manumission Society, he was a manumissionist, which I know is getting into like kind of history lingo there, but that's something we talk about at work too.
Yeah, well, so the difference between abolition and manumission would be me as an enslaver freeing the people that I own, versus abolition, which is some sort of like law or directive from the government or state or whatever to be like, no one can own people anymore. Correct? Just to clarify.
Oh, yeah. And, the New York Manumission Society was all about gradual manumission even. And I always kind of frame that in the sense that the members of the society were doing it in a way that it wouldn't really have any impact on them down the line. Yeah,
it's almost like the things that they wanted to put forth, the plans were so gradual that no one would actually feel anything ever.
Exactly.
You don't even want to notice it's happening, but we want it to happen, but not have any consequences.
Right. Exactly.
Now, was that true of all? Because I know there's other abolitions or manumission and abolition societies in the colonies at the time. Was that true of all of them, or was the New York Manumission Society different in a significant way from ones in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania and other states?
I actually don't know about that. I don't know if Flynn wants to speak to it.
That's a great question that I do not know the answer to. Good question, Isaac.
Well, yeah, the only reason, so me being the non-historian in the room, I feel like I say that once an episode. I think that there is and I apologize for my cat meowing in the background, which is also happening. At least in states where, and the anti-slavery movement was a little bit more fervent, Pennsylvania being full of Quakers who, by the 1780s were more interested in pushing for abolition, manumission, and all this kinds of things. It's a slightly different environment than New York.
And it would depend on the members as well.
That's
because
true.
Because from what I understand from your article, Jessie, it's sort of political versus personal beliefs. And if you do things for yourself, if you do things for what you believe is the good of something, the country or your state, versus political expediency.
Absolutely.
My favorite claim that you talk about Hamilton specifically, just generally about him being an abolitionist, is like, oh, he grew up in the Caribbean, therefore he would have seen how terrible it was because he was a good person and he would have seen people suffering. It's just, no offense to anyone who's written that in a book, but the amount of conjecture is staggering. When I don't know, are there any primary sources to back up that that concept?
Not that I found, and I spent a really good amount of time looking for them because that was in almost every book on him that I was reading. And I was like, well, it's got to be somewhere then. And it just was not. It was all speculation.
Yeah, it's almost as if we, the people writing, supplanted themselves into that scenario. And we're like, well, if I was a boy and saw this, then I would grow up clearly to hate it. But were you able ever to find the root of it? Like where that dead end began, like where that connection started? Or what was the oldest reference to it that you could find, if you remember?
That's a good question. I can't remember if it was in the first ever biography on him by his son. I don't know if he addresses that or not, but I definitely was reading it in 20th century biographies, which usually early ones kind of take their cue from the 19th century biography. So I wouldn't be shocked if it started at some point in the 19th century, but I don't know if I ever got to the source or if someone just decided one day that that must have been the case.
I'm just looking at who to point fingers at. I want to know who to blame for all of this misconceptions, because he in particular, I found, at least, so I've, going through, only recently starting to work in the history field myself, there's more conjecture about him than I think any other founding father. He seems to be, and it might be because he's like the guy du jour because of the play, and I've only started working in this area since that really became popular. But I've heard wild stuff, like multiple times on Twitter and on social media. People are like, Hamilton was black, he was Jewish, which I can't tell if it's sort of like based in like anti-Semitism and like because of the banking stuff, or whether it's just like, hey, he's not a normal white guy. But there seems to be just a lot of like stuff just kind of thrown around about him. And why is he particularly special like that? Like, I don't know, what is does he stand out amongst the founding fathers in a particular way that makes him more susceptible to that kind of thing? Or
my kind of take on it would be that it's because of the musical. I don't know. What I've heard is before the musical, maybe Lynn will know more about this, is that it would kind of flip-flop between him and Jefferson, who was more popular in, kind of pop culture, the history world. And I think with the musical, Hamilton has got the crown right now, and he probably will for a while.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors. Yeah, I feel like before the musical, Hamilton was known for his duel. I feel like that's what most people thought of when they thought of Hamilton. And it seems like since the musical, a lot more people feel that they have a personal connection with Hamilton, so they almost get defensive if you say something that they perceive as negative, even if it's historically correct. Have you seen that in visitors to the Schuyler Mansion? Are individuals changing? Are they, what kind of knowledge are they coming with?
Yeah, I have to say, I've been really fortunate. And from what I hear from my coworkers, we kind of all have been fortunate in that we get people coming because of the musical, or sometimes because of a historical fiction book they've read. Sometimes it is the Chernow biography, especially, that brings people there. But they usually come with a pretty open mind. And I have to say, shout out to the kids and young adults, because they really come with open minds and questions and are really eager to learn. But I really haven't run into anyone being really upset when I talked about, Hamilton as an enslaver, or even just other facts from, the musical that aren't correct. Like, one of the most common ones is Angelica and Hamilton did not have an affair, which some people are kind of sad about. Other people are.
It's juicy.
It is. And I always say we got a great song out of it, so I'm not complaining.
It's true.
It's true. Satisfied's a great number. But, people are there to learn, and we used to run a focus tour just on Hamilton. And sadly, we've had to kind of shelve it with COVID. And I'm hoping, I know once it's safe again, it's going to come back out. But I know we all have no idea when that'll be. But in that tour, we would actually bring out primary source cards and ask people to read them to the group. And it just got so much good discussion and really a lot of people with open minds. So I feel like we've been lucky compared to what I hear about some other sites.
That's interesting.
That's heartwarming to hear.
Yeah.
So when you went into, like, how did your article, just to walk through the timeline of it, when you first had the idea to do it, is that because you were, looking over these primary sources and you're like, hey, wait a minute, this kind of tells a story that's a little bit different? Or were you like, you went out searching for the documents that justified that article? What came first, the chicken or the egg?
So one of the big reasons I wanted to work at Schuyler Mansion is because of the work they were doing about slavery and the people the Schuylers enslaved in particular. So when I started working there, that was the research I joined in on right away. And that, Schuyler has a lot of documents, and unlike a lot of the founding fathers, no one edited his, which is great for historians. It also means we have a lot to go through. So as we were going through that, I was like, what about his kids? Did they enslave people when they were adults? Did they disagree? So I started with the sons, and I was like, wow, I skipped the daughters. What's wrong with me? So I decided. So, because for those who don't know, the three sons are in the middle. There's the famous three daughters first. So I went back, and I wasn't sure who to start with, but one of my former coworkers, Danielle Funicello, had written 2 posts on our site blog putting forward the question about Hamilton and slavery, but never found an answer. So I thought, I'll just write part 3. This will be interesting and I'll kind of bring it to a conclusion, right? Well, wrong. It took 2 years. And it was not a blog post at that point. But it kind of came out of me being interested in what Philip and Catherine Schuyler's children did. Did they enslave people? Were they against it? So after seeing her blog post, I thought I'll pick it up from here. And I went into it hoping he didn't, but I found otherwise, as we know.
I'm curious if the reason why people want him to be an abolitionist is because they see a reflection of current day America in Hamilton's vision. Because I would say that, I guess the way America currently runs is a little bit more Hamiltonian than it is Jeffersonian. There's large concentrations of power in urban centers, banking and financial institutions have like an immense important role, that we want the abolition to be part of our founding story. And people are sort of stretching wherever they can to try to find it. And he was the obvious, he's an immigrant. He was a member of this society. He didn't, own a plantation, which many of the other founding fathers, all the Virginians did. I'm curious if that's the case. And if that's the case, why doesn't anyone like Adams? Because he would be the more obvious choice.
I was just thinking about him when you were talking about that.
I realized he was also an option, but I was like, nobody likes that guy anyway. Yeah, I'm curious what you think about that idea that people are want to atone for the wrongs of our country and kind of make it so that no, they knew. Look, there were the people there that understood how bad this was.
Yeah, I think for a while people have wanted to find that in Hamilton, and maybe like you said, it is because he was an immigrant. He had a different background from the other founders, and maybe because he was a New Yorker and had so much to do with, like you said, founding how the country's running today. And then with the musical, I just think it's because a lot of people identified with his story. And, I think about Adams often. I'm like, we've just pushed him to the side. But, he could kind of fit that role. But I understand why his personality people might not be as willing to embrace. I think he's funny, but
I do too, Jessie. I'm right there with you.
Hamilton could be gallant. That's slightly different depending on what you're looking at. I don't know if anyone. I don't know if
Yeah.
if Adams is going to be the center of a musical at any point in time.
Here's hoping. Put that out in the universe. Put that idea out there.
It would just be a mid-century American play of a married couple arguing in a living room for 2.5 hours. It would just be him and Abigail just complaining about each other for an extended period of time and then making up at the end because they really do love each other.
I would see that, honestly. I'm not going to lie.
See it too. Every historian would probably see it.
What's that one of these days, Alice? It's like bang, zoom, straight to the moon. Like there's an old sitcom. The guy's always threatened to send his wife to the moon. I feel like that's a little bit of like the Adamses. Yeah, the honeymooners. Yes, that's it. That's funny. Oh, our producer Pat just sent us a note. Says you could call it the Addams Family. Ha ha.
Tricked people into going to see it, thinking something very different.
So, given it's interesting that you went in with not wanting to, but the historical. Did you feel any conflict in publishing this kind of thing, or you were sort of your mission is to get the truth out there, like based on those primary sources? Did you feel any internal, like when you found out, you're like, oh no, like when you see the signature on the transaction page, you're like, oh man, like what emotionally, what was that like?
Yeah, so I guess the reason I went into it hoping he did enslave people wasn't so much because of the musical or personally, I don't identify with him, and maybe that's because I'm a woman. I don't know why, but I just don't want people to have enslaved people in general. So I was hoping that, people were right about him. But when I found what I found, I was like, people have to know. And I didn't feel any conflict about it. I wasn't worried about it. I just felt like because I had found this, it was more important than anything I felt to put the truth out there. And I didn't kind of anticipate what would happen, but I also wouldn't change anything because it's worth people knowing. So yeah, I felt there were certain parts of it where it was just really heartbreaking to read about. Once I found some more personal things about the people he enslaved, it was just heartbreaking. And it was hard to, write at times, but I think it was important for people to know.
What I love so much about your article is that you're not necessarily uncovering this treasure trove of new sources, but you're taking sources that historians have looked at, historians have used, but they've looked at them in a different context or in a different way than you have. And I think it's so important for understanding how we write our history and the importance of who the individual is and how they look at sources. So you're taking sources that, famous historians have looked at and have come to different conclusions. And so, first of all, I would love if you could share maybe one story of a source that you found and how you read it differently than maybe, previous historians, just to show how a different perspective can really change the narrative of our history.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just have to say that the reason I think I was able to do that is because of what I've been doing with my coworkers about Philip and Catherine Schuyler's. We were going back over sources that, the site's been open for over 100 years. So people have read those sources, and I kind of learned from that how to do this. And with Hamilton, there are a few documents that people had kind of put into the category of he was selling this person to another person, which I always say that's horrible too. I don't understand how people are justifying that, but that's another thing. So I think one of the main pieces I found, and one of the earlier pieces, was a letter from him to, I want to say it's Clinton, and he's writing to him saying that they've had, believe he only refers to her, a woman of Mrs. Clinton, and the specific wording of it is really what kind of historians, I think, get into arguments over. And this is something we used on the Hamilton tour, and I would give both sides to the tour group and kind of present my reading of it versus the reading of other historians. And I wish I could remember the exact wording, but I basically argued that the specific use of words in kind of the context of how Hamilton writes in general, he was saying that he had purchased her from Clinton, from Mrs. Clinton, it seems in this case for Eliza, whereas other historians argued that the Clintons had basically sent her to work for the Hamiltons, and now she was returning to the Clintons, and that he was thanking Clinton basically. But to me, the wording just didn't line up for that. And also the timeline, it kind of made more sense that he would be sadly purchasing an enslaved person. He and Eliza were starting their married life. It all lined up in that sense. But ultimately, I use the wording as kind of the basis for my argument. And it's been read very differently by other historians. So I think that was one of the main ones that was up for debate.
So speaking of that, I don't want to dwell on it too much, really. But could you describe in like sort of like larger terms, like, so you publish this thing gets published, and what happens afterwards, if you don't mind describing that a little bit?
Yeah, so I really thought I'm going to publish this. It will probably get attention in like what I call the local history world, like the Albany history circle that I'm very familiar with, and maybe a bit of attention beyond that. But, how would people even find it? And I was wrong. I always say I was a bit naive about the whole thing. A local reporter was really, really kind, called and asked to just do a story on it. She just wanted to write about the fact this article had been written, and she had covered a lot of historical homes and similar things. And then other larger newspapers started calling, and that's when it kind of blew up into something that I truly did not expect to happen. Looking back, I absolutely should have, and I think everyone around me kind of knew this would happen, but like I said, I was a bit naive. And then, it kind of played out really quickly from there, and I was I guess surprised by the amount of attention it got, but then putting in the context of the Hamilton musical, and I think where we are as a country, it started to make a lot of sense to me that it would get that level of attention. But, to me, I was just, a girl at a historic site who wrote this piece. It got published by the historic site. And a lot of publications are put on, like these, PDFs are put on historic sites, websites, and they don't get that much attention. So that was kind of what I thought would happen. But it did get attention online. I did have to deal with some of the backlash online personally, but I did have the backing of everyone at work, both, the people I work with every day and some of the amazing people in the New York State Bureau of Historic Sites were reaching out to me. And then on Twitter, a lot of people started reaching out, just messaging me and saying, hey, I see what's going on. If you want to talk, I'm here. And especially Alexis Coe, really, I can't thank her enough for what she did for me. And it turned into a positive experience in the fact that more people came together and supported the article and me than didn't. So I believe humanity is good ultimately. And, that kind of changed my, went from being a kind of scary experience at first, learning how mean the online world can be, to being something positive.
So sorry for the interruption, but we're going to take a brief break now for a word from our sponsors.
I think it's a pretty unique experience. Very few people delve into the deep darks of the internet and come out with a positive affirmation about the state of people. But yeah, it was that's how I think we became aware of it, right, Lynn? Like we were in the process of developing this other project, and Hamilton actually sort of our work around Hamilton and Hamilton surrounding abolition timed out with that sort of wave of it was a little bit after it was published.
Right.
But there were people going back and forth. And if anyone hasn't checked it out, History Twitter is a remarkable thing. For any listeners that haven't checked, like gone on or that aren't on Twitter or aren't aware of History Twitter, it's its own little subset of historians. All the historians follow each other. And there's a lot of back and forth that goes on there. And you wouldn't be aware of it if you're not sort of dialed in, if you're not following the right people. But it's worth checking out if you're not on there.
Historians love to debate, so it is what we do.
Yeah, I can't imagine what attracts them to the worst possible platform for debate that's ever been created. In the history
Anyone
of
who asks a historian to keep it to a certain number of words, they're asking a lot.
But that's great. So it was ultimately an encouraging experience. That's very cool.
Yeah, no, I feel fortunate that it turned out that way. And I wouldn't really change it because ultimately the message was what was most important to me. And if that's what had to happen for people to read the paper, then that's what had to happen. I did actually meet a visitor at work. Every time someone told me they read the paper, I was like, oh my gosh, really? Thank you. Because I was so surprised every time. And she told me she read it because of some of the things she has seen. I don't know if online or in the newspapers, but that's what brought her to reading it. So, it was worth it then.
So what is it that all press is good press, or all...
Yeah,
it got it out there, right? And it's nice to hear that there is a supportive community, particularly with younger scholars. I think that's nice to hear, and that it exists on Twitter as well, despite what you might see in posts on History Twitter.
Well, it's an interesting thing, and it isn't. I understand you saying you were naive about the process, but I do think that there are some growing pains whenever a counter narrative is introduced, because like you were saying before the play, Hamilton and Jefferson kind of like flip-flopped back and forth between who's popular. And we don't, I think when we're thinking about, what is their national history, the narrative at any given moment feels static. Like right now, thinking about what the story of the United States is, it feels like this sort of rigid thing. But it's always true that that's not the case, and it's always sort of fluid and evolving, and work like yours, it happens all the time. We just don't even realize that it's happening unless you're sort of like in that community that's where the sort of the argument takes place. Yeah, because one of the things that one of the ideas that we're kind of exploring in this show overall is what gets sort of left out of the history books.
Mm-hmm.
And yours is a perfect example of that, in that these were sources that people had seen. It was stuff that had been edited or sort of contextualized in a way that didn't necessarily tell the whole story. Now, are you doing more work on Hamilton? Are you skewering him again? He's been tarred. Are you going to feather him now? What's the plan?
I think a lot of people are surprised to hear I've left him behind. I didn't intend to write, what I wrote. Honestly, like I said, I thought I was writing a third blog post. I am ultimately very interested in writing about slavery within the Schuyler family and the people they enslaved, and that kind of is what I just went back to after that was published and everything. I will say winter is kind of like the research writing season at work. So while we do and we have published a few things over the summer, our blog can get a little quiet, but then come winter, we're like, here's everything we've been working on. So I wrote about a woman named Silva, who was one of the people the Schuylers enslaved. Her and her three children were only some of seven people who were manumitted after Schuyler's death, and not in his will, but by his sons and sons-in-law. And I wrote about trying to find where did she go after she was manumitted. And it was, obviously different from my piece about Hamilton, but that was the type of research I was doing before and then even during the Hamilton stuff.
Very cool.
Can you talk a little bit about your, these primary sources that you get to use? Because I know that, at least for your Hamilton article, you used ledger pages and used financial documents. And I know I worked on George Washington's financial documents, and most people wouldn't get through a page before they'd just glaze over because they don't look that interesting. But when you really start digging into them, you can find an amazing amount of information.
Now, just to clarify before we start, can we define primary and secondary sources just for anyone in the audience that might not know what the difference is?
Sure. Yeah. Primary source is something that is, I always say, written within the time period by someone who's there, who's witnessed it. And it can be like a ledger book, a letter. It can be basically anything that was written by someone living in that time period. Whereas a secondary source is basically like the biographies we've been talking about that use those primary sources and bring them together, try to expand upon them, but are ultimately not written by people within the time period.
Cool. Yeah.
So,
just for
okay.
just for my own clarity's
Cool.
sake.
Oh yeah. Hopefully I did.
In case anyone was wondering, I knew the difference before I knew what they were before that. I was just asking for all of you people out there. So sorry, continue on.
Yeah, I feel like the cash books sound really boring at first. And if you're not interested and really like fascinated by what you're researching, then they absolutely are. I had to read them multiple times, and I am grateful he has good handwriting. Schuyler, his handwriting is horrible. So I'm glad Hamilton had some good handwriting. But it's actually really interesting because when I describe this to people, I say, I found out some of the charities he donated to, when he purchased a bed, what accounts he was keeping as a lawyer, what kind of the usual pay he got for just giving an opinion to somebody. So it's fascinating, from any perspective to go in there and look for something. And it's basically for Hamilton, I don't want to say the only, but maybe the only source that is completely unedited. Nobody, why would you think to edit a cash book, honestly? So it was the most honest. And that ended up being a really large portion of what I used because it just gave me the facts without, anyone scribbling things out or trying to change things.
Lynn, did you have the experience of wanting to believe, like when you're reading a letter, so not a cash book or some other ledger, and Jessie, you can speak to this too, of wanting to believe it? Because the letter, like a letter's written, and you're like, oh yeah, like they're just being honest because it feels like a letter. It's not a person. Like you're not thinking that like, oh, Washington is deceiving this human being that he's writing to potentially, or like omitting something or.
Absolutely. And I think that now, honestly, so with social media, it almost makes it easier to explain how authors at the time were thinking about their audience. When I speak to teachers, I'll work at the Mount Vernon Teachers Institute. I'll say to them, you would put something very different as a Facebook status as you would talk to a friend over drinks. You have to consider the audience. And there were also things in the ledger books that I was horrified to read and hoping that, I was misreading them but it's something you just you have to accept that they were human beings and, they made mistakes and stupid decisions, just like we all do, I assume.
It makes sense that the account books are the most honest. I mean, How do they take down Al Capone? It's tax fraud. Like it's always the money. It's like is the best way to find out what a person's actually doing.
And I don't know if the Hamilton, if they're ledger books, because I know they're also, they're called memorandum books, which are sort of like your receipts from stores. So in George Washington's, he would say, I gave some money to a guy on the street. And he would write that in that book. And it was sort of, much more detailed than the ledger book, where it's just very, business-like. So were there different types of ones in your research as well?
So I really only use the two that are digitized by Library of Congress in their Hamilton papers, and they call them cash books, but they are the type that really expand upon things. He was really detailed. Some things he was annoyingly not detailed with, but most things he did give the details for. So it was interesting to read in that sense.
Were there any things that you were particularly surprised about, or any kind of stories that you hurried up and told your friends about when you found them that day?
Like, oh man,
or am I the only one who does that?
He really loved cheesecake, didn't he? Got it every Sunday. What a weirdo.
I love that. I mean, in the office, we're constantly like yelling to each other, like, come here, I just found this thing, you're not going to believe it. And with his cash books, I think one of the things, this would be under the category of it frustrated me, was I think it was every week, I could be wrong, maybe it was every month, he was just giving money to Eliza, and it would just say, like, money to, I forget, I don't think he called her his wife, like, to Eliza. And I was like, for what? What? Because to me, that's very interesting. I want to know the details of the food she's buying. And I kind of got to see it in a roundabout way. This isn't in the cash book, but I was reading a letter her father wrote to her. And on one part of it, it had to be Eliza just was using it as a grocery list. And I was like, this is amazing. I forget what the letter was even about, because she was writing out like she was going to get mutton. I think like peaches were on there. And I'm like, this is what I'm looking for.
That's so funny. No offense, but you guys are nerds. And I mean that in the best way. I just think it's very funny. Not that I don't find that interesting. I've come to be fascinated by all of this stuff, but I just imagining someone in 100. I have a Post-it note on my desk that just says, kids back at school, remote capabilities, felt like I didn't have anything to do on it. I have no idea what this is for. Or what the reference was, but imagine if someone finding this in 250 years and being like, my God, I finally understand the man. It would be hilarious to me. Like, you're like, oh, she wrote her grocery list on the back of a napkin. I'm like, oh, thank goodness, the Holy Grail.
Yeah, it does take, I think, a really special, enthusiastic type of person to be excited by that.
No, but it's fantastic, because otherwise we wouldn't get to glean these things, because these are the things where, like Lynn was saying, people were honest. It's like, oh, you wouldn't have found out about the murder if you didn't buy the gun and you had the receipt for it. Like, no one's going to say like, hey, in their diary, like, planning to kill the dude, went and bought bullets yesterday. But you might find the cash receipt, and that's how you can sort of piece the puzzles together. I'm not,
exactly.
This is just a fictitious metaphor. I'm not alluding to anything in particular, despite the fact that Hamilton died in a duel. But it's very interesting and just fascinating that like something as simple as a grocery list could be very exciting and informative.
Yeah. And I think, especially with, I have to admit, I would have gotten excited about that with any of the Schylers, but Eliza in particular is kind of a bit of a mystery for the first half of her life. So to see something that she likely wrote that is just so ordinary and didn't get destroyed, I was like, a window into her life, finally. She was having mutton.
And peaches.
And peaches. It's great.
Well, I think that, sort of what we're getting to is you have the history, that's the big things. You have the wars, you have the politics, but historians, especially like us with our specialties, we want to know, what they wore, what they were eating. We want the everyday stuff. And I think that's what allows people to relate to these individuals. I've never really related to Alexander Hamilton. Honestly, I'm not sure if I do, but hearing these things about, Eliza, she's becoming more of a person to me. And we sort of talked about the idea of when history feels real and when it feels like another world, Isaac had a good description of history as reality.
Yeah, we were talking. Yeah, it was before the advent of video and photographs and things like that. Like all of it feels a little bit like a fiction. Like it feels like it wasn't real. Like if you pre-Civil War, I guess somewhere around there when they first photographs first started becoming relatively available. Where like the Crusades and Lord of the Rings kind of occupy the same space in my head. They both feel like fantasy. When I know intellectually that one happened. Actually, but they don't. They're not as far apart as you would otherwise like. But bringing someone to life, like you were saying, does sort of makes them more relatable. It brings them into my. I'm not having mutton today. I don't eat lamb, but but I have in the past. So there you go. Me and Eliza, 2 peas in a pod.
There you go. I really like that that metaphor, and just like. I get that a lot at work. People ask questions about who they were as people, and they often at the end of the tour will say, I never liked history, because of the way it was taught in school, but now I'm really interested because it was made personal. And that's honestly my favorite part of it too, because in my other life, I'm a writer, so I'm very much drawn to the personal. And yeah, I think that's the great thing about history.
I actually think I might take it a step farther than what you were saying, Lynn. It makes it more accessible, but I do think that understanding who there's both like, oh, this stuff was uninteresting, but it's also these details about people are inconvenient for the larger sort of romanticized narratives of people. Like the smaller details oftentimes contradict those sort of grandiose ideas of who these people were. Like, a modern example of it is, I don't know if you know any of the internal history that North Korea writes about Kim Il-sung, the founder of the dynasty, the Kim dynasty, whatever, and Kim Jong-il never went to the bathroom. He shot like a 7 on a golf course one time. Which would necessitate you hitting like 14 hole in one, like 12 hole in one. Like it was absurd. But they make him non-human, and that's how you sort of perpetuate that mythology. Whereas humanizing someone like Hamilton or any of the founding fathers does kind of makes it reduces the latitude that people have to make crap up about them for whatever purpose that may be. Like because it might sell a play, or it might get people in the seats, or because it might work for someone politically to kind of recontextualize a historical figure. But knowing who these people are with primary sources like you're talking about, that's, no one can go around saying that Eliza was a vegetarian, obviously, because of that particular grocery list. Incredibly unlikely. So I actually think it serves both a humanizing thing and a very practical, it adds a lot of historical value beyond the details themselves. At least that's how I see it personally, which is very... The work that you're doing is super cool.
I agree. It's both your research and just your work at the Schuyler House, interacting with the public. I think what you're doing is really important, and maybe filling in where our school days maybe left off or left out.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love my job. And I'm really happy. I'm actually a really shy, quiet person. So I think most of my teachers would be very shocked at the job I have right now, because I did not talk in class ever. But I just love interacting with the people who come through, and sometimes they teach me. It can go both ways.
Speaking of the Schuyler House, just to wrap it up, mostly because I would like to encourage all of our listeners to go visit if you ever. Where exactly is it? Just to.
Yeah, so we're Schuyler Mansion State Historic Site in Albany, New York. And we are open typically mid-May through the end of October. So if you want to visit, just give us a call, make a reservation. We'd love to have anyone.
Yeah, and no matter where you are in the country, there are small historical organizations like this everywhere that are doing, the kind of work that Jessie was just talking about doing, and getting down into the nitty gritty where that larger institutions just aren't able to do. They're not well suited. The Smithsonian is not well suited to do this kind of work. It's too large. It's not specific enough. But would you say that institutions like the Schuyler House are like what value do they bring to the historical community? I'm trying to pitch them. Like for people to go and to go to their local historical society and see the things that are around their house. Because no matter what town you live in America, there's probably one within an hour and a half drive of you.
Yeah. I mean, just personal experiences at work is, we get visitors from all over the world, but with Hamilton, the tour came locally at one point, and we just started getting so many local visitors who are like, I never knew this was here. And we're excited to interact with the history around them. And we're really excited about the level of work being done. I think sometimes there is a misconception that the only thing that happens at historic homes like these is, tours, and the history isn't kind of kept, I guess, up to date, which sounds a bit weird because, we think of history as being in the past, but as we've been talking about this whole episode, it's constantly being revisited. And I think people are pleasantly surprised to find that at historic homes. And I've had so many people say to me, oh, if you're ever in this state, you got to go here or here. And I think that kind of speaks for itself that people are out and about exploring these places, and whether or not they live near them, they're incredibly valuable to them.
Absolutely. That's a great pitch. I'm a big fan of historic sites, and I know they don't get a lot of money. They don't get a lot of support. And so the support they really get is from the American public and individuals visiting who are able to go and to support people like you who do this amazing research. And, yours, thankfully, became nationally, if not internationally known. But there are a lot of stories out there that may not get that coverage that are really important to a town or to who we are, as a nation, as individuals. And so I'm a big fan of historic sites.
Yeah. So go. I don't know where you are, you listening right now in your car, in traffic, on the way to work. Go. Stop where you're going. Take the day off. Turn around, head home. Not home, to someone else's home, a historical home, somewhere.
I support that.
Well, as we berate our audience, I just want to thank you so much, Jessie, for joining us today. We had a really great conversation. Hope you enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was really fun, and I'm so glad I got to come on and talk with you.
This was wonderful. And, for people who want to read your article or who maybe just want to learn more about what you're researching, is there some website they should go to, or how can they find more of you online?
So if you want to read my article, if you go to Schuyler Mansion State Historic Sites landing page on the New York State Parks website, scroll down and it is a PDF there. If you want to read our other research, we have our own blog. I always say just Google Schuyler Mansion blog and it'll come right up. We have social media accounts, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. If you want to find me, I am mostly on Twitter, personally. And just searching my name will probably bring it on up there. But I always encourage people to check out all of the mansion accounts too, because we kind of get to take you to places that we might not get to on tour, literally, like the attic and basement. So check those out and see, you might find some more stories there.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessie.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the full episode of Too Complicated for History. We hope you enjoyed the episode, and if you did, please leave us a review on Odyssey, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Be sure to follow us on our social platforms at 2C4H_podcast, or check out the link in the description. This will keep you in the loop for show updates, new episodes, and exclusive content.
Too Complicated for History is a podcast from Primary Source Media, produced by Patrick Long and Lynn Price Robbins, edited and mixed by Curtis Fritsch, opening theme music by Sheena Biratello.